The Wildlife Chuckwagon mix. What's in it? What are the thoughts behind the design of this mix, and is it potentially a good mix for you and your project? Let's explore those thoughts here. So the Wildlife Chuckwagon mix is a mix of different wildflowers designed for wildlife and a general scope of wildlife, you know, everything from pollinators to quail to turkeys to deer, all different types of wildlife. The Wildlife Chuckwagon mix is also designed to be economical. So those things that we have in abundance here at the seed company, maybe the harvest was really good on something or another, those are the things that we try to also put in this mix while keeping in mind to have a diversity. And we do have a well-balanced diversity. The species are fairly equal as far as the percent of mix that they're in the mix in. And so the reason that we designed this one to be economical and to not, you know, some of the other mixes are definitely more expensive. They have more specialized species in them. They have more unique species in them. But from the wildlife standpoint, we're just looking for diversity. So it is something to keep in mind if you're using one of the other mixes, say butterfly and hummingbird. It's a more expensive mix. Maybe you would like to use part butterfly and hummingbird mix and part companion grass mix. That's always an important part. But then part Wildlife Chuckwagon mix to lessen up the cost of it a little bit. So that's always a factor you can keep in mind as you're designing your own personal mix for your planting. Speaking of that companion grass mix, there are reasons that I think that putting grasses into a mix is really important. And again, the Wildlife Chuckwagon mix is just a wildflower mix. So there's no grasses in it, but the grasses are an important part of wildlife habitat, and they do a couple things. One, they provide structure in a way that the wildflowers don't. Wildflowers, I really think of them as like a pencil sticking out of the ground, and they vary. You know, there's hundreds of species of wildflowers, so of course they don't all look the same. But for the most part, they're much more upright, and they don't have the leaves that kind of fountain at the base. And so wildlife use that structure, those leaves, in a different way than they use upright plants, right? And so, like for instance, bumblebees like to get in under the fountain overishness of that grass during the winter, and they hibernate there. And so we need to make sure we're providing habitat for them. So that's one reason, is the extra structure and habitat that the grasses give. Second, if you ever want to do a controlled burn, which can be a really big benefit to a native grassland, it's not required, but it sure is a nice tool to use. It's a very historical thing that happened on the grasslands. If you want to use a controlled burn, the grasses are needed to carry that fire. The wildflowers tend to not carry a fire very good. 3, the color of the grasses is often better during the winter. So, I mean, we're not talking like beautiful blooms kind of color, no pinks and purples, but we are talking like, you know, a richer shade of brown, a richer shade of rusty brown. The grasses have a lot of benefits, and I like to mix at least 25% grasses in there. Now, a lot of times people from the wildlife standpoint don't want real tall grasses. So big blue stem Indian grass can be as tall as a man on horseback. A lot of times people avoid those for a wildlife mix. Not that they're necessarily bad, but you do need to think through the applications, and grazing in conjunction with those grasses can be really excellent for some species of wildlife. But that aside, the Wildlife Chuckwagon mix often gets planted in non-grazing situations with a mix such as the companion grass mix. So we're talking grasses that are this tall, give or take depending on your soils, but things that don't get quite as tall as the big blue stem and Indian grass that are super tall. Other benefits of this mix, there's many, and it really kind of depends on the person's interest as to what they consider to be a benefit. Of course, wildflowers are beautiful, and a lot of the wildflowers in this mix are going to have really pretty blooms on them, have a lot of color at different periods of the year. To some people, that's a benefit. To some people, they're like, you know, I'm not into pretty wildflowers. They're just into wildlife habitat, and that's fine. Medicinal and edible plants might be your thing, might not. Making bouquets, whether fresh bouquets or dried bouquets, might be your thing, might not. So there's a lot of different uses, but also some of the benefits that we get for the environment are things that we can all appreciate. So the soil health, when you have a diversity of plants growing there, things green in different seasons, so some of them are growing in the spring, some of them in the fall, some of them, you know, even kind of through the winter a little bit. We have a lot of soil health benefits when we have that, and soil health benefits drive the health of the microbial population. They drive the health of, I'm even convinced that our streams, our fish health, so we're talking about wildlife here, the health of our fish can be impacted by how much water gets into the soil up on the hillside. And so if we can get that water in the soil up there, our fish populations can be healthier, our streams can be healthier. And if you want to explore that thought more, we've got other videos where we explore that more. The species that are in the wildlife chuckwagon mix are always different. From year to year, from season to season, they'll vary. And that's because this mix, we don't always have the same thing in abundance, or even on the shelf. We can have a drought year where we aren't able to harvest any given species. And so the contents of the mix are always changing. But to give you an idea of what is in this mix, let's look at different things that would be useful for wildlife habitat in different ways. There are so many different needs of so many different wildlife, and then some wildlife have the same needs, right? Like quail and turkey are going to have similar needs in some ways as to the habitat they're getting from plants, because they're both birds and they both eat insects and they both eat seeds. And so maybe a way to look at what is in this mix would be to look at the different things that are provided. In other words, this plant produces green leaves during the winter. This one produces a nice meaty seed that would be a tasty bite. So let's look at a few of those different contents in that way. Plants that are green in the winter would include things like white beard tongue, common black-eyed Susan, tick-seed coreopsis, whereas plants that have a big seed might not. Some of those plants might be in that list as well, but they might be unique from that list. So the silphiums, things like compass plant. The sunflowers have a nice meaty oily seed for wildlife. Things like Maximilian sunflower or ashy sunflower, sawtooth sunflower. And then of course there's species that are taller, and this mix is not afraid of tall species. Things that might not necessarily look neat, tidy, and attractive will definitely be in this mix because it's a wildlife-focused mix. So if looking neat and tidy is a concern, consider one of the other mixes in the landscaping line might be a much better option. But anyway, back to things that look tall, that provides a certain habitat element, right? That provides shelter from heat. It provides, depending on what you are, you can bed down in some of those tall plants if you're, say, a deer. So things that are tall in this mix might be things like some of the sunflowers, things like the vervains, like blue vervain. And of course, in the wildlife world, there's a whole list of species of animals, of wildlife, especially in the insects and pollinators, that are specific to a certain plant. For instance, there's a coreopsis bee, and it only collects nectar and pollen from coreopsis plants. So without that plant, you don't have that species. So there's at least 20 different species in here, and some of those are going to be important to one animal or another just because they are that certain species. If you're at the point of considering if the wildlife chuckwagon mix is right for you, there's other resources on our website that might be really helpful. One of those resources is a planting guide. So how do I get the seed out there, whether it's mechanically or whether it's by hand? We've got videos and articles to help you do that, to help you, give you some tips and pointers, because we've done it a lot and we want to share those with you. Another really important resource is the establishment timelines. Maybe you've already killed your existing vegetation, but maybe you're in a situation where you haven't done that yet. And it is so important to the success of a planting to kill the existing vegetation just nearly all the time. There's very, very few exceptions. The reason for that is because these seedlings, they start small and they don't want a lot of competition. And there's going to be plenty of competition, but if there's existing perennial plants, they take all of the sunlight, the moisture, the nutrients, and the little seedlings have about zero chance of surviving. So if you haven't prepared your site yet, those will be some really good timelines for you to consult. And if you have questions about the mix, if you have questions about which timeline is best for you, any questions like that, either give us a call or shoot us an email and we'll get back with you. I'm Elizabeth with Hamilton Native Outpost. Here at Hamilton Native Outpost, one of our passions is to design mixes that work well for people, that solve problems for you.